ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and submit extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This crucial legislation will finally protect taxpayers and victims of fraud against the largest theft of tax dollars in American history. Americans are suffering under a cost of living crisis fueled by Democrats' reckless spending. It has brought us to the brink of recession and spurred the highest increase in interest rates in 16 years. It must be infuriating for folks to also see that it's not just the American dream that's being stolen from them, but their identities and their tax dollars. Criminal organizations and foreign fraudsters exploited the pandemic to steal hundreds of billions in payments intended to keep workers afloat amidst government lockdowns, and the victims, they need our help. How much has been stolen? The Department of Labor Inspector General told the Ways and Means Committee that taxpayers may be on the hook for at least $191 billion in improper payments. And that's just the lower estimate. Outside experts estimate up to $400 billion of improper payments. While working Americans were trying to piece their lives back together during the pandemic, Democrats did nothing to fight fraud. When Democrats held the majority on Ways and Means, they ignored, they blocked, and shot down common sense safeguards and refused to hold even one hearing on this fraud. That inaction made it clear that their soft on crime agenda does not just apply to carjackings and looting department stores. It applies to defrauding the federal government as well. During a State of the Union, President Biden said, "The watchdogs are back." He rolled out the position of chief pandemic prosecutor at the Department of Justice. Since then, even as we've discovered more instances of fraud, the Biden administration official responsible for prosecuting it has resigned, and the position sits vacant for months. That's not accountability. We couldn't afford inaction for the last 2 years, and we can afford it even less today. These are stolen tax dollars, which makes every person in America a victim of this fraud. Today's vote is an important step towards ending the suffering and delivering accountability. The Protecting Taxpayers and Victims of Unemployment Fraud Act gives states the tools they need to go after fraudsters and shores up vulnerabilities by improving identity verification and modernizing state UI systems. It allows states to retain 25% of fraudulent federal funds recovered. This is a real incentive for states to pursue what can be costly investigations and prosecutions, because now they can use recovered funds to improve UI program integrity and fraud prevention. These dollars can go towards hiring investigators and prosecutors to go after criminals to recover fraud payments. This will also give states the resources to modernize systems and technology to better verify identity and income for unemployment and deter, detect, and prevent improper payments. This legislation also allows states to keep 5% of UI overpayments recouped in the future to continue to improve benefit delivery and eligibility verification. This includes matching state lists against databases, which will help reduce payments to deceased and incarcerated individuals. Many of these reform ideas are bipartisan and very long overdue. Some are supported by the Department of Labor Inspector General and were even included in past budget requests from President Trump, President Obama, and even Biden has included several of the ideas in the Protecting Taxpayer and Victims of Unemployment Fraud Act in his most recent budget request. I'm hopeful House Democrats will join here to also protect taxpayers and support this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. Democrats strongly agree that those who took advantage of the COVID crisis to commit fraud must be held accountable. Indeed, Democrats put $2 billion in the American Rescue Plan to fight fraud, and every House Republican voted against these investments to prevent fraud and to hold criminals accountable. These Democratic anti-fraud dollars helped the Department of Labor create an important cross-checking system to catch fraudsters who apply for unemployment in one state while receiving income in another, a practice for which a Republican House member reportedly was indicted earlier this week. Republicans are playing a dangerous game by cutting ongoing successful work by the federal government to fight fraud and leaving states to pick up the pieces. The Department of Labor expressed deep concern about how H.R. 1163 will throttle essential ongoing efforts to strengthen and protect the uninsurance program. Instead of punishing organized crime, the Republican H.R. 1163 guts federal funding to fight fraud, weakens state unemployment systems, privatizes American public service jobs, and sends cruel surprise bills to innocent workers who were unemployed during the pandemic. We bipartisanly enacted pandemic unemployment benefits that kept an estimated 5 million people a year from falling into poverty. This assistance meant revenue and customers for businesses and helped spur our economic recovery. Unfortunately, when disaster struck, state unemployment systems were not prepared. Mistakes were made, and thousands of workers were overpaid. Again, we worked bipartisanly to encourage states to waive overpayments to protect unemployed workers. Now Republicans want to force states to claw back accidental overpayments from workers up to 10 years later. So when my GOP colleagues incorrectly assert that the bill limits the clawback of overpayments to fraud, they're only referring to a very narrow limit on the ability of states to keep portions of recovered fraud payments. My Democratic colleagues and I offered many amendments to invest in anti-fraud efforts, protect workers, and strengthen state unemployment systems. The Republicans rejected every amendment. Instead, the GOP careens toward ahead with H.R. 1163 that the CBO estimates is a net cut in federal investment in fighting unemployment fraud and strengthening unemployment systems. And that is why so many organizations oppose H.R. 1163, including the AFL-CIO, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, the Communication Workers of America, the National Employment Law Project, and the Service Employees Unions. I urge my colleagues to oppose this dangerous bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Illinois reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 3 minutes to the subcommittee chairman of the Work and Welfare Committee, Mr. LaHood from Illinois.
Gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Today, Republicans are following through on our promise to the American people last fall, our commitment to a government that is accountable. I rise in strong support of H.R. 1163. This long-awaited bill is needed to address the unprecedented levels of fraud in pandemic unemployment programs. Every dollar going to fraud is a dollar that did not go to those who actually needed it. My home state of Illinois paid out nearly $2 billion in federal funds for fraudulent unemployment claims, nearly half of the money paid out by the state. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to submit for the record an audit by the State of Illinois Department of Economic Security from June 2020. Those fraudsters acted with intent and malice and diverted critical relief for unemployed workers. Early on in the pandemic, multiple red flags were raised by law enforcement agencies about the threat of fraudsters using stolen identities to file false unemployment claims. The U.S. Secret Service raised the first alarm, issuing an alert memo in May of 2020 warning of a well-organized Nigerian crime ring exploiting COVID-19 crisis to commit large-scale fraud against state unemployment insurance programs. Mr. Speaker, I'd additionally like to submit for the record that memo from the U.S. Secret Service.
Without objection.
The public needed to know what was happening to these funds, yet not a single oversight hearing was held at the time. Democrats turned a blind eye to fraud and rejected Republican efforts to stop it. While considering the American Rescue Act in committee, Democrats rejected Republican amendments that would have stopped the, quote, pay and chase model of benefit delivery. In September of 2022, Democrats voted against a resolution of inquiry demanding communications showing the Department of Labor had knowledge of unemployment insurance dollars flowing to international crime syndicates. Now, today, Republicans are taking action. We will not turn our backs and walk away from the greatest theft of taxpayer dollars in American history. Currently, state workforce agencies have little incentive to pursue costly investigations and prosecutions that do not pay out. This bill here today, H.R. 1163, will jumpstart efforts to recover what we can by making the juice worth the squeeze. For states still working through a backlog of suspicious unemployment claims and appeals, the number of individuals or entities facing UI fraud-related charges has grown since March 2020 and will continue to increase as these cases take time to develop. Based on an analysis of the U.S. Department of Justice from January 13, 2023, federal charges were pending against up to 240 individuals for attempting to defraud pandemic UI programs. States that take the initiative will be allowed to retain a portion of the recovered funds to prevent future fraud by using the recovery reward to improve program integrity, including hire investigators, and to go after criminals and modernize state systems. This bill, 30 seconds.
30 more seconds.
Gentleman has 30 seconds.
This bill allows a state to retain 5% of the recovered UI overpayments. This includes having common sense procedures in place like preventing UI benefit payments from going to incarcerated people and deceased people. We have an opportunity today to gain some restitution for American taxpayers. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 1163, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 90 seconds to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 90 seconds.
Thank you. After President Trump twiddled while thousands of Americans died of COVID, we entered a national crisis. And in that emergency, the Trump administration, the Biden administration, and the states did not do enough to prevent fraud in this and other programs. If Republicans were genuinely interested in strengthening anti-fraud efforts, as I certainly am, we could today approve bipartisan legislation to do that. Instead, they reject many of the important recommendations that their own witnesses before our committee from the Government Accountability Office and the Inspector General told us were necessary. Instead of protecting taxpayers today from fraud, they use this misnamed bill to actually cut the very funding that is required for anti-fraud and recovery of wrong payments. When millions of Texans found themselves out of a job, the Texas Workforce Commission was not ready to provide a lifeline. Even in the middle of the night, my neighbors could not get through to get the insurance to which they were entitled. Little wonder that the same state agency did a sorry job of preventing fraud. The vast majority of Texans who eventually received unemployment were entitled to it, unlike, apparently, an indicted member of the Republican caucus. Our unemployment insurance system should be strengthened not undermined, as this very bill would do. I yield back.
From Illinois Reserves, the gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the chairman for yielding. The premise of this bill is simple. Criminals and fraudsters should be held accountable for dollars that were illegally obtained. And we ought to ensure that this doesn't happen again. We can argue, we can talk about how we got here, who's responsible, but I can tell you as a member of the Ways and Means Committee, we spent the last 3 years, Republicans on the committee, pleading with the Biden administration and with Democrats for answers on the impact of unemployment fraud, for ways to stop it, and the steps that we need to recover as much of it as possible. But unfortunately, it fell on deaf ears, and now we have some counts as high as $400 billion that were lost to fraud or improper payments under the program. That's money that should have been supporting our constituents that were struggling from job loss during the pandemic. Instead, it went to criminals and cheats. In my district, too many unemployed individuals could not access payments because those benefits had already been claimed by scam artists. Similarly, for the last 2 filing seasons, many of my constituents have only found out then that they were a victim of identity theft when they got a 1099 in the mail that says they owe taxes on unemployment benefits they never claimed. Now, they're stuck fighting the IRS to rectify their tax bill and hung out to dry trying to reclaim their identity. Finally, after 3 years, House Republicans are taking this important step today toward righting this wrong. This legislation gives states both the incentives and the tools needed to prosecute criminals and recover fraudulent payments. It takes the steps that we should have taken 3 years ago to prevent fraud in the first place. I do want to be clear. This bill is not about taking away employment benefits from those who relied on them, who needed them during the pandemic. Quite the opposite. 30 seconds? 30 seconds? Yeah.
Additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for 30 seconds.
It's not about taking away unemployment benefits for those who relied on them. It's quite the opposite. This bill goes after those who robbed unemployment benefits from those who need it. I'm hopeful that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will recognize that this is common sense legislation to right a wrong and to protect our constituents and our taxpayers. I yield back.
Reserves, the gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California.
Gentleman from
Mr.
California
Thompson.
is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank the gentleman for yielding, Mr. Speaker. The COVID-19 pandemic significantly impacted the economies of every country around the world, resulting in great economic shutdown. However, our country, the United States, came out of the pandemic ahead of other nations because we expanded programs such as unemployment insurance. Sadly, this bill seeks to target Americans who received overpayment from the government at no fault of their own, instead of going after those who committed fraud. During the bill's markup and later in the Rules Committee, I offered an amendment that would amend the criminal code to extend the statute of limitations to 10 years, as recommended by the Department of Labor Inspector General and legal experts, so we could get the crooks. However, the Republicans decided to go after public servants and retirees instead of the criminals. One of the other members said that criminals and cheats need to be brought to justice. They do. Extend the statutes of limitations and we can do it. We can catch the bad guys. We can catch the crooks. We can get the taxpayer money back. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Illinois Reserves, the gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2.5 minutes to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Tinney.
Gentlelady from New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of H.R. 1163, the Protecting Taxpayers and Victims of Unemployment Fraud Act. This bill makes meaningful strides to recover hundreds of billions of dollars in fraudulent unemployment benefits. Congress has the responsibility to oversee our nation's unemployment programs and rein in rampant fraud. Unfortunately, for years, Democrats virtually refused to acknowledge the extent of this issue, while taxpayers and small businesses in New York's 24th District were forced to foot the bill. Criminal organizations, including international cyber crime rings and other foreign actors, even exploited this national crisis to steal billions from taxpayers. The exact amount of unemployment fraud resulting from the pandemic is not known. Estimates are wide-ranging, with some encompassing only improper payments due to fraud and others focused on all improper payments, including those resulting from administrative error. The Government Accounting Office found at least $60 billion in fraud as they testified before our committee. However, according to recent testimony from the Department of Labor Inspector General, improper payments in pandemic unemployment programs have saddled taxpayers with at least $191 billion as testified before our committee, and some experts suggest this number could be as high as $400 billion. New York alone is estimated to have paid as much as $11 billion in fraudulent unemployment benefits since March 2020. On top of all of this, New York has an outstanding trust fund loan of nearly $8 billion, which is yet to repay. Because of New York's gross mismanagement, taxpayers and small businesses must now make up the difference. After all the hardships they've endured over the past several years, how can it possibly be fair to ask them to pick up the tab for the government's negligence and incompetence? Now, under House Republicans and the leadership of Jason Smith, Congress is finally taking steps to recover these valuable taxpayer dollars. I urge support for this bill from all my colleagues, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Oregon, Congressman Blumenauer.
Gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. I'm having flashbacks in terms of what we were facing in 2020. Every member of my office was working to try and deal with panicked people who couldn't get through to get their unemployment in a system that was bogged down. 600% increase. Now we're taking up legislation that would cut fraud-fighting dollars and hold hard-working Americans liable for overpayments that were not necessarily their fault. Families would be forced to repay these funds up to 10 years later. Even the Congressional Budget Office has said there's uncertainty about how much would be recovered. I was in the middle of that. I saw the panic, the challenge, and the despair. I think it would be far better to take advantage of extending the statute of limitations so we make sure we can claw it back, but don't punish people who may be caught up in this net that was not of their making. I strongly urge that we reject this, that we deal with ways to increase the statute of limitations and recover the money that needs to be recovered.
Gentleman from Illinois reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, my colleagues on the other side have noted their objection to this bill's rescission of unobligated COVID funds sitting unused at the Department of Labor. They claim these funds are important in combating UI fraud, but the reality couldn't be further from the truth. I'd like to submit for the record a February letter from the Missouri Department of Labor and Industrial Relations. In it, my state's workforce director notes their experience with Tiger teams. It says, quote, recent funding opportunities such as the equity and Tiger team grants provide limited flexibility to address program integrity and ongoing fraud prevention strategies. This doesn't sound like a glowing review. I welcome Democrats to share any information that they have that the Department of Labor efforts have helped us recover dollars for American taxpayers. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield
Without objection.
Thank you. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Estes.
The gentleman from Kansas has 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of the Protecting Taxpayers and Victims of Unemployment Fraud Act. Right now, our federal government is borrowing $1 out of $5 we spend, over $45,000 a second. This fact alone should outrage every American. Yet we face another outrageous problem here in the swamp: waste, fraud, and abuse. Not only are we borrowing at historic rates, but we're borrowing to cover the costs of rampant fraud that exists, frequently unchecked in our systems. This was magnified during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. While there were good reasons to expand unemployment benefits when many Americans were displaced from work through no fault of their own, we are already 3 years removed from the passage of the CARES Act, and the pandemic emergency declaration is over. Not because the Biden administration followed the science and voluntarily gave up their emergency powers, but because the House Republicans and the Senate came together to force the Biden administration to end the pandemic emergency declaration. One troubling data point that emerged is the unemployment claims as a percentage of unemployed workers. This was 37% in February 2020, right before the pandemic came to our shores. Yet by August of the same year, it had climbed to 216%. The data is clear. We were paying massive amounts of unemployment to people who were not unemployed. It's estimated that of the $873 billion in total pandemic UI benefits dispersed, about $357 billion went to fraudulent claims. No member of Congress should be comfortable telling their constituents that they don't care about wasting nearly $400 billion of taxpayer money. In my home state, a forensic audit found that the state of Kansas paid up to $466 million in unemployment fraud. While this massive fraud was occurring, hardworking, unemployed Kansans were competing with fraudsters to receive the unemployment benefits they deserved and so desperately needed. In my office in Wichita, we received countless calls from Kansans who were trying to reach an ineffective Kansas Department of Labor. One constituent waited over half a year after her claim mysteriously ended up in the fraud department. Others reached out to let me know they'd been victims of fraud, some receiving a 1099 claiming they owed taxes on benefits that somebody else received. These cases point to a real problem in Kansas and across the country. Taxpayers lost out to fraudsters who used the pandemic, vast sums of federal funds, and weak state leadership to gain the system. Thankfully, there's a solution that protects the taxpayers and reins in the fraud we've seen in unemployment insurance. The Protecting Taxpayers and Victims of Unemployment Fraud Act won't make everybody whole, but it ensures that some of the hundreds of billions of dollars are recouped, and it lets states keep 25% of those funds so they can improve their own unemployment insurance systems. To be clear, unemployment is a critical lifeline that helps Americans during a challenging time. When bad actors abuse the program, it hurts those who actually need it by taking away monetary and human resources. The bill, 30 seconds.
Additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for 30 seconds.
The bill is a right and fair approach to ensure unemployed Americans have full access to the assistance they need, and when done correctly, encourages those individuals to get back into the workforce. Tackling waste, fraud, and abuse in unemployment insurance shouldn't be a partisan issue. It rights a wrong and is just common sense. Mr. Speaker, I encourage my colleagues to join me in this common sense legislation that puts taxpayers first, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New Jersey, Congressman Pascrell.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, the other side, respectfully, Republicans, created a once-in-a-century crisis. Once in a century. They're holding this sham debate to distract us. In 2021, Democrats passed the American Rescue Plan. It had a very strong fraud protection section. I hope you read it. Our unemployment aid was a gigantic success, by the way. It kept families together, and it saved lives. Republicans claim to care about misuse, but when we passed real fraud protections, every single one of you voted no. That's the record. It's clear. House Republicans are harboring a disgraced fraudster who was just arrested on unemployment fraud, and you cannot make it up. We're prosecuting fraud. States recovered over $100 million. Enforcement is working. This is not about
time
fraud
has expired. Members are
or about saving money.
Members are reminded to please direct your comments to the chair. Thank you so much. The gentleman from Illinois reserves. The gentleman from Missouri. Sir, your time has expired. Gentleman's time was expired after my recommendation to direct the comments to the chair. Thank you so much. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentle lady from California, Ms. Still.
Gentle lady is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, as we all now know, pandemic unemployment assistance funds became the source of the greatest theft of taxpayer dollars in American history. Estimates put the total amount of assistance lost to fraud as high as $400 billion. California alone lost around $60 billion under the leadership of President Biden's Secretary of Labor nominee, Julie Su. As Californians in particular continue struggling under spiking prices and high taxes, it is absurd to force them to foot the bill for fraud committed while their leaders were asleep at the wheel. That is why I am proud to support the Protecting Taxpayers and Victims of Unemployment Fraud Act, which will address this unprecedented theft by incentivizing states to recover these stolen funds and providing the tools to prevent future fraud. Government caused this problem, and it owes to American taxpayers a solution. I urge all my colleagues to vote yes on this measure and provide the fiscal oversight we were sent here to deliver. And thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Speaker, and now your 1 minute to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Evans.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, this bill is not about addressing fraud. My home state of Pennsylvania is already fighting fraud with the American Rescue Plan funds that support new positions in American job centers. This bill targets innocent workers who have no idea that their state made mistakes in meeting unemployment benefits. This bill targets innocent workers whose emergency benefits was kept for their households afloat. The bill targets innocent workers who went back to work as soon as they could and offered lower pay. I urge my colleagues to let states focus on real fraud and protect innocent workers by voting against this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You back.
Gentleman from Illinois reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Carey.
Gentleman is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 1163. Our job recovery has been hampered by bloated COVID relief benefits that paid people more not to work, while criminals and fraudsters were lining their pockets with billions in taxpayer funds that expanded UI programs. Now, we're not talking about everyday fraud or administrative error. We're talking about fraud that was committed with the intent both domestically and by foreign nation actors that, frankly, use COVID relief to conduct economic warfare against American citizens and put our national security at risk. In my home state of Ohio, it was estimated that $1 billion may have been paid in fraudulent unemployment from March of 2020 to June of 2022. Now, my friends on the other side are arguing against this bill, and the administration has just released a statement of administration policy opposing this bill. The fact is, the president's fiscal year 2024 budget request includes several of the very same fraud recovery and prevention measures that my colleagues across the aisle are railing against today. 3 of the proposals in the president's budget are nearly identical, allowing states to keep 5% of recovered overpayments and reinvest those dollars in program integrity and fraud prevention. Matching unemployment claims data against the National Directory of New Hires to verify when somebody's receiving unemployment becomes employed. Extending the statute of limitations for criminal charges and civil actions for persecuting fraud from 5 to 10 years. After declaring that the watchdogs are back in his first State of the Union, the president nearly 2 years to finally embrace the anti-fraud policies that we Republicans are calling for today. Were the president to veto this bill, he would be vetoing the very same policies he endorsed. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
From Missouri reserves, the gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's now my pleasure to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from my home state of Illinois.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all share the goal of fighting fraud. And as my colleague just said, there are things that we can and do agree on, but this bill isn't that. Our focus should be about going after those who stole unemployment insurance money and fixing the broken systems that enabled them. Instead, the Republicans' bill seeks to claw back funds included in the American Rescue Plan that would allow the states to do what we're asking today. Mr. Smith's bill will make it easier for the bad guys to cheat the system, not harder, and it will hurt the hardworking, law-abiding citizens. Countless honest taxpayers hit hard by the pandemic followed the rules of their state, received their benefits, and used those funds to pay for their children's health care, to pay their rent, and simply to make ends meet. They had no way to know the state had mistakenly overpaid them. But during the markup, I asked Chairman Smith what protections were included in this bill to ensure that honest taxpayers didn't get surprise bills or face persecution from states for the state's own mistakes.
The gentleman from Illinois reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
30 seconds.
I'm sorry. The gentleman from Illinois has 30 seconds.
Thank you. So during the markup, I asked what protections were in place to protect those honest taxpayers. Neither the chair nor any of my Republican colleagues could point to any protections. While both sides of the aisle care about fighting fraud, and I know we do, this bill makes clear that only Democrats care about protecting hardworking, honest Americans from receiving surprise bills and being treated like criminals. Thank you. I yield back.
Now the gentleman from Illinois reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Moore.
Recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 1163, the Protecting Taxpayers and Victims of Unemployment Fraud Act, which addresses the urgent need to safeguard taxpayer dollars from unemployment insurance fraud schemes. One of our most crucial oversight duties is to ensure the responsible use of taxpayer funds. Recent reports from the White House, GAO, the Department of Labor, and other organizations have exposed the alarming theft of up to $400 billion in taxpayer dollars due to unemployment insurance fraud during the COVID pandemic. This revelation demands immediate action. This is what we're trying to accomplish here, is to show a plan that's feasible to be able to go after this fraud. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle talk about wanting to, they want to go after fraud too, and these arguments that we're talking about are missing the point. This bill will go after the fraud that took place. It's introduced 1163, and it will help enable the recovery of lost dollars, ensuring that this stolen money is reclaimed. Now, while fraud has been widespread across this nation, some states have demonstrated success in minimizing these losses. In Utah, my home state, overpayment due to fraud consisted less than 1% of total benefits dispersed. I'm proud of this. Our leaders in Utah have done an excellent job managing and protecting these resources thanks to the systems and processes implemented by former Governor Herbert, Governor Cox, and their administrations, and the Utah State Legislature. The federal government must now work to restore public trust. This starts with holding bad actors accountable. This bill will enable that by strengthening the integrity of our systems for the future and encourage states to be proactive rather than reactive. I urge my colleagues to support this fiscally responsible bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentle lady from Texas, Congresswoman Jackson Lee.
Gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
I thank the gentleman. Let me say that I believe in border security, the southern border, and the fact that we're a land of immigrants, as well as we're a land of laws. Two bad bills that don't fix the immigration border security problem, and here we are not fixing any problem of fraud. Let me explain to my colleagues, but also the American people. They take away $400 million that we use to eliminate fraud. How does that work in H.R. 1163? This bill is to claw back, allegedly, funds that people allegedly received accidentally. And this is what will happen. Let me tell you what they are going to do. They're going to make sure that law enforcement, first responders who every day were out during the pandemic because they accidentally received an overpay. I had an amendment. They rejected it to exempt law enforcement. And we are, in fact, coming upon National Police Week next week when we honor and memorialize them. They wouldn't take that amendment. They wouldn't take the amendment to exempt firefighters. I saw them out when I was out, testing, vaccination, people in crisis during the pandemic. They were out, and they wouldn't take exemption of school teachers. This is a bad bill. Why are you punishing those? Let us take this bill off, go back to the drawing board. We're losing, we're not gaining. I yield back my time.
The gentleman from Illinois reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr.
From North
Speaker.
Carolina, recognized for a minute and a half.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of H.R. 1163, Protecting Taxpayers and Victims of Unemployment Fraud Act. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw the words unprecedented many, many times. Today, we stand at an unprecedented crime scene. Of course, during the course of the pandemic, the American taxpayer was subjected to one of the greatest heists ever committed, to the tune of about $190 billion in improper unemployment payments. My colleague across the aisle said, yeah, they received the money accidentally. Well, if I walk up across the street and find a $20 bill accidentally dropped by someone else, do I not owe that money back to them? Is it mine to keep? No, it's not. It's to be given back. And this is what was done from payments to the American taxpayers who did not deserve the money. So, of course, the spending spree by the Biden administration wants to continue by adding ballooning debt to our national deficit. Today, House Republicans are presenting a solution to this unprecedented problem. We're not raising taxes or spending our grandchildren's money. We're merely asking for money back that was not owed to those people. It's simple. Why not reclaim the billions of dollars in improper payments before spending another cent of taxpayer money? Even school children would understand such an issue. It's past time we rectify this disaster and hold accountable for those who got money that they did not deserve. Thank you. I would urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm now pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Illinois, Congressman Foster.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As Congress's physicist and computer chip designer, I rise to make the simple point that the massive levels of UI fraud and identity fraud generally did not happen in countries that have a secure and trusted digital ID system. This is well known to residents of many states as the mobile ID, or digital driver's license, that allows a real ID compliant driver's license to be placed onto your smartphone and to use the unique hardware ID of your phone and its biometric login capabilities to prove that you are who you say you are, online or in person, and to prevent anyone from impersonating you. Last session of Congress, we came within a whisker of getting it included into the omnibus, that the federal government should start recognizing this proven form of digital ID. And so, unfortunately, H.R. 1163 is a bill that's designed to fail in the Senate. And if we start working with our Senate colleagues, I think we have a chance of making real progress in this. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'll reserve.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byer.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I stand in opposition to this bill. It is nothing more than a disingenuous attempt to undermine the federal unemployment insurance program, which provided a critical lifeline to millions of Americans during the pandemic. My Republican colleagues say they're concerned about unemployment fraud. Well, I am too, but this bill does nothing to claw back stolen UI funds. In fact, it will go a long way towards stopping the ongoing successful work by the federal government to fight fraud and hold criminals responsible. It would rescind $2 billion in funding provided to the Department of Labor to strengthen the UI system and improve fraud detection and prevention, and replace it with a bizarre set of incentives for the states to go after ordinary workers who are overpaid through no fault of their own years after the fact. The Department of Labor assistance facilitated by the rescue plans made a huge difference in my Virginia. Following the guidance, we were able to make a significant dent in the unemployment insurance appeals backlog that has plagued our state system for years. There's no question our unemployment system needs improvement, but this bill would make the system more vulnerable to fraud, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Illinois reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Malay-Takis.
Gentlelady from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since House Republicans have been in control, we've brought transparency to the people's house. We are the ones who are protecting taxpayers. We are the ones exposing waste, fraud, and abuse, including as high as $400 billion in COVID relief and unemployment fraud. Sadly, my home state of New York ranks near the top of the list with an estimated $11 billion in fraudulent unemployment benefits. These taxpayer dollars went to fraudsters, many overseas, as far as China, Russia, Nigeria. They even went to dead people. They spent it on Rolex watches, fancy furnishings, designer goods at Louis Vuitton, Chanel, Burberry, Gucci, $10 million villa in Dominican Republic, $3.5 million on a mansion in New Jersey and a charter jet to get a fraudster who purchased it to and from. Porsches, Ferraris, Bentleys, BMWs, and Mercedes-Benz. One person even received $1.5 million over a span of 10 months. Meanwhile, my district office in Staten Island and Brooklyn had to help dozens of constituents who had their identities stolen and could not get unemployment benefits they desperately needed. New York had to take an $8 billion loan from the federal government, which it has not paid back yet, by the way, to cover all this. And now our small businesses are paying the price with higher unemployment assessments. The bottom line is this bill would help crack down on this type of fraud. It would give law enforcement the statute of limitations it needs for criminal charges or civil actions, incentivizes states to help us crack down and recover these fraudulent payments, and it stops unemployment insurance payments to incarcerated and deceased people. I don't know how anyone can't support this bill. Thank you.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the distinguished ranking member of the House Ways and Means Work and Welfare Subcommittee for the time. Mr. Speaker, this bill, the Surprise Billing Our Workers Act, is another extreme MAGA attempt that threatens to punish hardworking constituents whom, at no fault of their own, may have been overpaid unemployment insurance benefits. If deficiencies and errors on the part of the unemployment authorities in each state cause an overpayment, this bill would allow the government to go after those funds for up to 10 years. Imagine that. Constituents in my district in North Las Vegas who have been working hard, paying their bills and taking care of their families suddenly gets a surprise bill that says that they owe hundreds or even thousands of dollars. On top of that, you want to go after fraudulent people gaming the system? We have laws and resources in place to go after networks and individuals who purposely try to get money that they're not entitled to. Just look at the member from the other side of the aisle who was indicted yesterday for unemployment fraud, among other things.
Gentleman's time has expired.
May I ask for additional 30 seconds?
30 seconds.
Gentleman has 30 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, last Congress, I introduced the Unemployment Insurance Technology Modernization Act, which would prevent fraud and address the technical shortcomings of many state unemployment programs. I would ask my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to work with me and other colleagues to actually provide solutions. Stop targeting our constituents. Let's go after the corporate cartels that are involved in this fraud of our unemployment insurance, but let's protect the unemployment program, which is a bridge to people who need it. My constituents face the second highest unemployment during the pandemic.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I will fight for them every step of the way.
Gentleman's time has expired.
The
The gentleman from Illinois reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, you are making Missouri proud, doing a great job up there. Democrats, they falsely are claiming that this bill claws back relief funds from Americans who received an overpayment through no fault of their own. The language in this bill is crystal clear. It is focused on recovering overpayments due to fraud. That means intent on the part of the individual. Intent on the part of the individual. Existing law already protects individuals who receive overpayments through administrative error or otherwise. In fact, Section 2104 of the CARES Act allows states to waive overpayments on a case-by-case basis if the payment would be contrary to equity and good conscience. This bill also explicitly states in Section 2A2 and Section 2A3 that, quote, the state agency may retain 25% of any amount recovered from overpayments of pandemic emergency unemployment compensation, this is the one you need to understand, that were determined to be made due to fraud. Not overpayment, due to fraud. I reserve.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to inquire as to how much time is remaining.
Time inquiry. The gentleman from Illinois has 14 minutes. And from Missouri has 3.5 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And now I yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from California, Congresswoman Kamala Dove.
The gentlelady from California has 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to condemn Republicans' attack on our workers. The GOP's Surprise Billing Our Workers Act would allow states to send surprise bills to workers for unemployment benefits overcompensation paid to them during the pandemic for as long as 10 years after the overpayment was issued. Is it the job of the American people to keep the receipts of 10 years past of UI payments so that they don't go to jail? People who applied for these benefits and were overpaid did not know they had been overpaid. These were the result of a government mistake. To add salt to the wound, Republicans want to cut fraud prevention programs by $400 million over the next 5 years. Unbelievable. And this legislation hurts our state employee unions by allowing states to contract out jobs, which is what led to this mess in the first place. Let's be clear. This is an old trope from the Republican playbook. Blame and demonize poor and black women, insinuating they're gaming the system when Republicans have their own welfare queen to deal with. How can you possibly lecture Americans about paying their bills when you fail time and time again to come together and meet your financial obligations as a country? I yield back.
Gentleman from Illinois yields. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Yacom.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. I rise today in strong support of H.R. 1163, the Protecting Taxpayers and Victims of Unemployment Fraud Act. The Department of Labor's Inspector General pegs pandemic-era unemployment insurance fraud at $191 billion. Though other experts say it could run as high as $400 billion. These are staggering figures. This fraud enriched criminals. It harmed innocent Americans who faced processing delays, stolen benefits, and stolen identities. These were not victimless crimes. H.R. 1163 takes a couple of important and common sense steps towards addressing this fraud. First, it extends the statute of limitations so that we can continue to investigate reports, recover taxpayer dollars, and prosecute the fraudsters. More importantly, it incentivizes states not just to recover fraudulent payments, but to shore up their systems against future fraud by allowing them to use a portion of recovered funds for program integrity and fraud prevention efforts. The unemployment insurance program is an important part of our safety net that helps Americans recover from a job loss. But the pandemic exposed major flaws that are in desperate need of attention. I support the bill before us today because we shouldn't just catch the fraud that was, we need to stop the fraud that will be. H.R. 1163 takes steps to ensure that we in Congress and Americans across the country have faith in this program to deliver during difficult times. I want to thank my good friend Chairman Smith, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Missouri reserves. The chair will receive a message.
A message from the President of the United States.
Mr. Speaker,
Madam Secretary,
I am directed by the President of the United States to deliver to the House of Representatives a message in writing.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And now I yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from California, Congresswoman Chu.
Gentlelady from California is recognized for 1 minute.
I rise in opposition to the Surprise Billing Our Workers Act. This bill would harass workers with surprise bills for unemployment benefits that were overpaid due to state errors. These workers, many of whom work long hours for low wages, rightfully use these benefits on basic needs such as utilities, rent, and groceries, with no way of knowing that there was a mistake. State agencies who were simply not equipped to expeditiously get out pandemic unemployment benefits, resulting in a number of overpayments to workers who filled out their applications honestly in states led by governors of both parties. There's no denying that there were wrongdoers who exploited the emergency programs set up by Congress to assist American workers. However, this is not an excuse to go after honest Americans who did nothing wrong. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this bill.
Gentleman from Illinois reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I reserve, Mr.
The gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Ohio, Congresswoman Sykes.
The gentlelady from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I joined Congress, I was a state representative in the great state of Ohio. And during the pandemic, my office fielded hundreds, if not thousands, of calls from parents, seniors, veterans, farmers, and families, all who needed help, and we did. Unbeknownst to my constituents, the IT systems at the state agencies in Ohio processed those claims. Those IT systems needed to be updated. The staff roles had been decimated and protections were not in place. Then months after those families sighed a breath of relief, they received a letter demanding repayment. Mr. Speaker, if you've never been on the other end of a phone call where someone has cried or wailed in fear or financial ruin or how are they going to feed their families or pay their bills or get their medication, I can understand why you would vote for this bill. But unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, I have and I cannot support this legislation. I understand the need to stop fraud and I understand the need to do this work, and I look forward to doing it with you someday, but this bill would not do it. In fact, it actually eliminates $2 billion of funds to update the systems that caused this problem and put my constituents in this situation in the first place. I was sent here to fight for families, to lower costs, not to criminalize Americans, and support them with bills that will help their families live the American dream. That's why I will offer a motion to recommit H.R. 1163, and I ask unanimous consent to add the text of this amendment to the record immediately prior to the vote on the motion to recommit.
Without objection. Gentleman from Illinois reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve, and we are prepared to close.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers. I would close.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for close.
Speaker, I yield myself the balance of my time. Democrats strongly agree that those who took advantage of the COVID crisis to commit fraud must be held accountable. And that is why Democrats put $2 billion in the American Rescue Plan to fight fraud, and every House Republican voted against it. According to the Department of Labor's trust fund, only 16 states met the required solvency standard for unemployment systems. Instead of punishing organized crime, and instead of addressing the fragility of state unemployment systems, the Republican H.R. 1163 guts federal funding to fight fraud, weakens state unemployment systems, privatizes America's public service jobs, and claws back overpayment for workers who were unemployed during the pandemic, who received overpayments through no fault of their own. And I am shocked, Mr. Speaker, that the Republican leadership is advancing this bill that guts federal investment in stopping unemployment fraud the same week when one of its own is indicted for such crimes. I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill that punishes America's families while stunning accountability for actual criminals. I urge a no vote and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The only way that this bill punishes American families are American families who are fraudsters. American families who intentionally create and commit fraud. Give me a break. After years of inaction, when Democrats held the majority, taxpayers have lost anywhere from $191 billion upwards to $400 billion in fraud, and their identities have been stolen. Democrats, they ignored it, they blocked it, and they shot down common sense safeguards. And guess what? They refused to hold even one hearing on fraud. American workers, families, and small businesses, they're already dealing with a cost of living crisis, and they deserve better. That's why they elected a Republican majority on the promise of a government that's accountable. Today's bill delivers on that accountability with common sense reforms that empowers the states to make things right. With this vote, we will end the greatest theft of taxpayer dollars in American history. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to do the right thing and vote in favor of this bill and against fraud. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
All time for debate has